Right, so now we're going to change direction a little bit and actually get the true story of an organisation's approach to building resilience. And you used a term when you described it to me, JP, that you started off from a position of anti-resilience, which was really quite an interesting, way of positioning it. So we'd love to hear the story from your perspective in Capital One. So over to you, JP.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah, anti-resilience is not what I want to be associated with our brand by any means, but fortunately, we learn from our mistakes, and that's where our story begins. So let me go ahead and make sure, can everybody see the screens? Carrie, maybe if you could voice over, Mohan, if you're up mute, let me know if you can see showing up local resilience.
Yeah, we can see. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, excellent. So really excited about the role that we're getting ready to play and our trajectory, I think, in the last year and looking forward as we think about some of the economic headwinds and the increased role and weight that we'll carry in Capital One Philippines. But before we help enable greater resilience across our global network, the story begins with us focusing on how we shore up the local resilience and what that means on a micro level. As critical as it is, I think arguably that's probably a top priority more than ever for any operation at scale these days. But as Carrie teed up for us, the story that I'm going to share with you today actually begins with, I think, failure in many regards as well too, as we fail to, I think, see the first opportunity to invest and prioritize resilience appropriately. And I'll share a little bit of time because my guess is most of the folks on this call for the different organizations that you represent probably were on the winning side of, I think, seeing which path to take when in March of 2020, COVID-19 put us all in a position where we were all challenged with revisiting our existing operating models and figuring out how do we adjust to what was back then just just a massive injection of uncertainty into our industry. Now, fortunately, I think the challenges for resiliency in some ways were a little less complex in the form it was somewhat binary: deploy work at home or maintain status quo operations. And while most folks, I think, successfully and very quickly integrated a remote working operating model and even evolved that, in Capital One Philippines, we actually spent the first 18 months and maybe some change hunkering down and just figuring out how to operate within the brick and mortar building. And I think we might have been among the only financial service providers who took that course. And the cost was significant. If you take a look at the slide, you can see that those two individuals who they're not practicing any ballet steps or anything, they're actually doing, I think, about one of a dozen steps that it took each day to get into the office, where ultimately they ended up just working remotely within the building. So it's really challenging. And when I say it was really challenging, the impacts of not having the right resilience locally made themselves known in more ways than we even tried to capture on this slide here. But let's talk about some of the big ones. First and foremost, when you talk about dependability of staff being where they need to be, when you expect them to be there, from our BAU performance, we saw an increase of almost 400% with regard to the out of office percentage on any given day as we progressed and hit its peak during the Delta swell as well. In employee attrition, and when I think about resilience, talent plays such a critical role in resilience itself. Our employee attrition hit all-time highs. We've been in the Philippines as Capital One since 2013, and not only was it the worst that we'd ever seen, it was rising with no foreseeable end in sight. And then while we were losing folks out the door of existing employees, as we had requests to play a more significant role to help shore up the challenges across the global network, fortunately, we lacked the ability in candidate pool to backfill. In fact, for the first time in our history, we were going down in size, even though there were requests for growth. We just couldn't attract the talent as in our market. As it's incredible. The Philippines, as many of you know, have some of the highest concentration of industry talent. And with that comes a lot of great knowledge and a lot of closely connected friends and social circles. And so our challenges and our reluctance to, I think, deploy work at home impacted our candidate pool as well too. So needless to say, this was not sustainable. Now, that aside, we ended up turning it around into a great story. And I think in the fourth quarter of last year, shortly after our current president, Oz Parvez, and myself arrived, we deployed and were able to send our 4,000 plus associates across the Philippines, all ranging as far south as about 160 kilometers from our location as signified in that little blue dot there. That's where we operate out of in Alabang, or at least that was where our primary model was, our primary building was before we deployed work at home as well too. So we got to experience the first time what resilience looks like when all of a sudden you move from the concentration of one location and start to spread out a little bit. And it was pretty remarkable, the impact that it had. But we knew after we had deployed, and as we started to look back on how we got to that spot and why we were so late to integrate some of the practices that others had already deployed in the name of resilience, one of the things that we did that was critical is we committed to going forward as we think about designing our operating model, leverage a broader set of insights and very deliberate systemic learning methods to ensure that our own biases or siloed knowledge would prevent us, or at least we could reduce the risk of making a similar mistake and getting it wrong again. What did that mean more tactically? Well, one, we actually ended up partnering with McKinsey and funded what was, I think to this date, one of the most robust in-market studies focusing on the labor market sentiment, as that has evolved and I think forever changed as another function of this pandemic as well too. Looking to see what the voice of the associate was looking for going forward. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have access to the right talent, resilience will always be an elusive goal. We also partnered far more closely within the industry with critical leaders and partners such as IBPAP and many more, and other leaders and peers who led similar organizations within or outside of our industry as well too. Looking at it as we think about the future of work, nobody really knows the long-term answer. We have a lot of good ideas and a lot of good experiences, but it's less binary than maybe that original choice. And we wanted to treat each opportunity of interaction as a way to see how people are testing and learning their way into the future, try and glean some successes from individuals. And then we also prioritized more than I think we ever have before, the insights and offerings of our associates as well too. As I mentioned, again, we arrived shortly before deploying for work at home. And I'll tell you, 98% of our associates knew what the answer was. I think we just needed to figure out a better way to let their voice help shape the strategy than we did maybe previously. And the result of all this, by the way, was a lot of rich insights and data on what the future of work should look like to enable a resilient local market as well too. Thousands of surveys, interactions with peers, tons of focus groups and other discussions as well too, and that continues to this day. And when we pull it all together, there's this combination of insights that we were able to glean and results that told us, hey, we're heading in the right direction ever since we've made those adjustments and prioritized resilience through a different lens. One, I think many of you have seen so many forms or fashion of this stat, but obviously the global interest for the labor markets across the world continues to highlight that work at home is here to stay, and it should be in some form or fashion where it makes sense. But in the Philippines, you see an even greater skew and desire for some form of hybrid or work from home. And within our organization in particular, you see only 4% felt that they needed to be on site to be successful in their roles as well too. So that was telling. After deploying, I already shared as well too, the results were pretty compelling as well too. All of a sudden, we went from worst in just about every metric to first in every metric. So said differently, the investment and prioritization of the associate feedback was paid forward to our customers in the form of best ever business results as well too. But it's important to note that that was one way to think about resilience, that deploying of work at home for the pandemic. Forever and more, I think if we're going to be able to carry a larger weight for our global organization, we need to ensure that we have a stronger foundation here locally. So we're thinking about resilience in multiple ways as we prepare for a more prominent role in our global footprint, getting ready in the coming months and years. The one that is a recurring theme, the health and wellness component, as long as we see varying degrees of success with regard to immunization rates and boosters and more, there's always the risk that COVID will continue to see more and more iterations and different variants as well too. So we continue to enable and empower our associates to be able to be educated and have easy access to vaccines and boosters, and help to ensure that we're able to stay ahead of whatever the country rate is here locally. We also think about what can we do with the work at home structure now that everyone's deployed, how do we optimize it to minimize the risk of utility disruptions, whether it be in the form of power or internet and more, and are investing heavily in that space. It's also worth noting that here in the Philippines, as incredible and as rich as the talent is, we also have, I think, the highest concentration of natural disaster risk overall. And when you think about the typhoons that we experience, with a super typhoon coming through Metro Manila as recently as a few days ago, to earthquakes, our building in that little map that we had a little while ago in that blue dot actually sits right on a fault line within the Ring of Fire. And if the movies have taught me anything, I think you might be able to see Godzilla is somewhere accurately, I think, in the sea somewhere over there on that map too. So there's no shortage of items to keep us up at night that we need to prepare for. But the other part, and I keep anchoring to it very deliberately, the talent component is such a huge part of our resilience. And when we think about all of the growing needs in the next couple of years, we want to ensure that we have got the right supply. So some of the unique things we're doing are partnerships with the Taloy Foundation is one example. It's a wonderful group that actually pulls kids off the streets who may have been abandoned, gives them food, shelter, the opportunity to learn, and as they progress and get to the right age, we've actually developed the first of its kind program that allows them to opt into training that teaches them over the course of 6 months the skills necessary to be successful in the IT BPM industry. And to date, 80% of those have ended up coming on to be hired with Capital One Philippines, while the other 20% have had opportunities within the industry elsewhere, which is a beautiful story. We're also starting to ratchet up the number of water towers that we deploy, oftentimes in schools and underserved communities where having clean water is a challenge. And now we've recently added another water tower, and with each one that we add, that provides clean water for 2,000 individuals on a daily basis. So it's one of the ways to think even further out in the future, maybe 5, 10 years and beyond, to make sure that we've got a really healthy, thriving community and the labor market that we benefit from, and we have enough talent to make sure that we all thrive, even with the ever-growing competition that we have here locally. So really excited about what we've learned, where we've come and where we're going, and how resilience has forever changed our thought when we talk about global footprint.
That's an awesome story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, JP. So I've just got one quick immediate question for you, and then obviously we'll discuss more in the panel. But was it the same sort of like working from home strategy deployed for Capital One all around the world, or was this specific really to the Philippines operation?
Yeah, our domestic partners in the US actually were ahead of us, and they did deploy at the onset. As a result, we were able to leverage a lot of the learnings, and I think that benefited us when we deployed. But at the same time, there were a lot of nuanced differences that required us to take a different approach. So I'd like to think that we took the best of what we could, but ultimately, like, market differences forced our hand to customize where needed as well too. So I will add, Carrie, as a result, by the way, of the differentiation, I think we now find ourselves in a position where we're able to, in turn, help our US domestic force and partners learn from what we've done as well.
Excellent. So it's going full circle now, which is brilliant. Thanks. Right, let me just see. We've got a question pop up in the Q&A, which I will ask you now because we do have a little bit of time. So, JP, do you communicate to your potential clients about the natural disaster risks you have in the Philippines? And is there a reason for them not to work with you? Ooh, good question. Thanks, Marika.
Yeah, one, we're very transparent about all risks. We're really proud about our overall value proposition. And when we weren't resilient, for a number of reasons as well too, not the earthquakes itself, but for even really not being work at home, we've actually said no to businesses that we wanted to say yes to. And so we won't bring anyone on until we feel confident that the juice is worth the squeeze, and that the benefits outweigh the risks as well too. Now, as far as the impact broadly, I think it's something that you're aware of, and you think about how do you mitigate that. In any market that we'll represent here today, and on the ones we sit in, there's no eliminating risk. There's simply understanding it, mitigating it. And I think we've got a lot of great partnerships that go beyond the IT BPM industry with local leadership to help give us a lot of confidence that we'll continue to be a great place to do business for many years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's mapping out, understanding those risks, and always having a strategy for really addressing them. And I'm imagining this is sort of like reviewed on at least a sort of quarterly, if not monthly basis. So yeah, great. Thank you. That was awesome. And we'll invite you to the panel shortly. So now we're going